Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, murder in Tehran, the killing of another Iranian nuclear scientist, and the way that story's been reported.
The covert war to slow down Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon.
Russia Today, news channel or Kremlin propaganda tool?
We've gotten used to seeing this during the Arab Spring, but now New York.
The U.S. Congress and a court in New Delhi, both with critical decisions to make on the future of the internet. And graffiti comes alive in our web video of the week. It sounded like something out of a Hollywood film, an Iranian nuclear scientist murdered in a car bombing, the fourth such scientist killed since 2010. But this was no movie, and among the questions being asked, which of the actors involved in the dispute over Iran's nuclear program was behind the killing? Reports in the Iranian media blamed Israel. The Israelis made a point of neither confirming nor denying that. While in the U.S., mainstream media outlets saw the killing and the subsequent fallout as just another step closer to war with the Islamic Republic. This is one of those news stories that reveals a thing or two about news outlets through what they say in their coverage, how they say it, and what they omit from their reporting. And it's also exposed some of the divisions that exist within the political power structure in Iran. Our starting point this week is Tehran.
Making headlines around the world.
An Iranian nuclear scientist has been killed in a bombing in Tehran.
This is how the careers of Iran's nuclear scientists sometimes end.
So who is killing Iran's nuclear scientists?
Usually the news media love a catchy alliteration, and this story had one ready and waiting. They could have headlined it "Terror in Tehran," but the Western media chose not to use the T word.
Media terminology is extremely important. It sets the tone for how the story is perceived by the audience.
What experts call a precision kill.
Many media outlets have various style guides about how they go about reporting such stories.
Fundamentally, the basic rule when you look at the Western media's coverage of terrorism is that terrorism is what other people do to us. It's not what we do to them. And the classic example is this recent killing, which by any definition meets the definition of terrorism. It's a killing of a non-combatant, a civilian, for political purposes to try and change policy.
The Iranian state-controlled media really didn't hesitate. Within minutes of the news breaking, it was very obvious for the Iranian regime this is an act of terrorism.
The latest terror attack bears the hallmark of a 2010 attack.
But whether you call it by other names or not, that's beside the point. It's assassination. It's an act of terrorism.
That the bombing in Tehran was not called terrorism may have had something to do with the list of suspects.
Iran has accused the U.S. and Israel in being involved. This is while some experts have not ruled out Britain's involvement.
But compare the terminology used in this story with what we heard 3 months ago.
A major terror plot.
When the U.S. government accused Iran of a far-fetched plot to kill Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Washington. A conspiracy that we were asked to believe included a failed used car salesman from Texas, as well as some bad guys from a Mexican drug cartel.
Now, put aside the absurdity of that story, let's assume it was true. You look at the coverage in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, on CNN, on ABC News. Universally, all of the coverage was headlined terrorist plot, terrorist assassination, terrorist regime. And yet, when our side, when the West or the West's proxies engage in targeted killing, so-called, or assassinations of non-combatants, it's never called terrorism. We use all these euphemisms.
The covert war to slow down Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon.
And it's a total brazen double standard.
Iran has denied the allegations. We have a number of correspondents on this story tonight.
I was in Washington that day, and I can only describe it as a media tsunami. It was unbelievable. You could not flick news channels without going to the same issue being covered, and it was actually basically everywhere covered. The media attention was massive. And of course, it's understandable because it's the United States, whereas the recent assassinations in Iran have gotten play in the US press and around the world, but nowhere near the alleged assassination plot in Washington.
Inside Iran, a lot of people thought it was just too ridiculous for words. There was many people appearing on state television when the story came out. The Saudi ambassador is still alive and well, while our scientist has been murdered. So they spent a lot of time inside Iran illustrating how different the stories are portrayed themselves. They think it's very interesting that the American media outlets actually use this latest story, the assassination in Iran, are interested in it for just a day or two, and then it goes away.
Despite the Iranian government's grip on the media there, they do not all speak with one voice. Some news outlets are controlled by Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Others are loyal to President Ahmadinejad. And the Iranian media's output on this story has surprised some people.
On the Iranian side, there's almost, I wouldn't say silence, but they're not milking this story the way some people might expect. It seems to me that the Iranian regime has sort of looked at it and said, okay, if we continue dwelling on this issue, we will make ourselves seem weak, because after all, one of our scientists got assassinated in the capital of Iran, and we couldn't stop it. So I think there's an element of trying to contain the embarrassment from this incident.
The Iranian state news organization, Press TV, reported President Shimon Peres of Israel basically denying any Israeli involvement, which is fascinating because the Iranians don't usually do that. The Iranians themselves are moving away from accusations that this was only an Israeli job. They also moving towards, very strongly towards a possible involvement of CIA and also the British MI6.
And some of Iran's factionalized media outlets have not stopped at condemning those responsible for the attack in Tehran. Within a week of the bombing, some were taking the domestic debate in a different direction.
A debate about, okay, why was Mr. Roshan assassinated? What is the end objective of Iran's nuclear program? And what price is Iran going to pay for this nuclear program? The beginning of another round of debate about this cost-benefit analysis that, frankly, the Iranian nation has never had throughout the course of this nuclear program.
And I can tell you, as somebody who's been looking at Iranian press for the last 5 years, at the very least, I've never ever seen this amount of criticism being leveled at Ayatollah Khamenei himself, which is something really new, and it's quite shocking, and it shows how inside Iran we're seeing map-changing events in politics, which is being reflected in the Iranian press.
We have a nation which is intent on becoming nuclear.
It is a new and terrifying twist in the nuclear standoff with Iran.
This is a multifaceted, multilateral story of accusations, counterclaims, disputed intelligence, as well as media double standards. And truth is already a casualty of a war that hasn't even started yet.
Iran has a lot of things wrong with it, but to simply portray it as some monolithically evil, scheming, totalitarian state bent on producing nuclear weapons no matter what happens is a total distortion of the truth and is a betrayal of those viewers who switch on their 24-hour news channels. Journalists have an obligation to try and break down barriers, to try and spread information, to try and portray foreigners, foreign governments, foreign countries accurately, fairly, and that's not happening with Iran.
It was an act of war.
Act of war.
Our Global Village voice is now on the coverage of the murder on the streets of Tehran.
The recent murder in Iran of a nuclear scientist heralds a new and dangerous territory in the ongoing covert war between Iran and the West. The media coverage, though, has been equally revealing. Most importantly, when America, Israel, or the West, us, commits terrorism, we call it counterterrorism or defensive tactics. When Iran does it, of course, we call it terrorism. What's been interesting in the last few weeks in much of the Western press is how so many mainstream commentators have been supporting the murder of nuclear scientists as if somehow terrorism committed by us is acceptable.
If we can compare the claim of the assassination of the Saudi ambassador in October with the actual crime and actual targeted killing for Iranian scientists from 2010 up to now, in this media, I think that unfortunately this is why the Iranian public opinion never can trust to Western media.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Web users around the world got a crash course in something called SOPA when a reported 7,000 websites took part in an online protest, what they called the Day of Darkness. The online encyclopedia, Wikipedia, as well as Reddit and Boing Boing were among the sites to shut down for 24 hours to protest a law that's currently before the U.S. Congress called the Stop Online Piracy Act, SOPA. Anyone trying to access Wikipedia saw this message: imagine a world without free knowledge. On the Boing Boing site, the message read, Boing Boing is offline today because the U.S. Senate is considering legislation that could kill us forever. Supporters of the proposed law, which include major players in the film and music industries, say this legislation will protect companies that are currently losing billions of dollars to online piracy. The law would give the U.S. government the power to shut down sites associated with piracy and would threaten web users who stream or download pirated material with jail terms. Critics argue the law goes much too far. The Obama administration seems to be leaning towards the critics for now. It has said, while we believe that online piracy by foreign websites is a serious problem, we will not support legislation that reduces freedom of expression or undermines the dynamic, innovative global internet. The Indian government is backing a court order that has significant implications for major internet sites like Facebook and YouTube. Last month, a court in New Delhi ordered 21 sites to remove content deemed anti-religious or anti-social. Now the government is saying it finds it appropriate to proceed against the accused persons in the interest of national harmony and integration. The internet giants want the case dropped, saying it's impossible for them to monitor all online content before it gets posted. A judge in the case has already said that India may follow China's lead and block websites if those companies fail to cooperate. This case goes back into court in March. India has more than 100 million users, making it the world's third largest internet market after China and the United States. In Turkey, the investigations and court cases following the murder of a prominent Armenian journalist have come to an end, with 2 people found guilty, another 19 suspects released for a lack of evidence. Hrant Dink, the founder and editor of the Armenian-Turkish newspaper Agos, was shot on an Istanbul street back in 2007. Dink had angered Turkish nationalists by describing the mass killing of Armenians a century ago as a genocide. He had also been convicted in 2005 of insulting Turkishness through the media. The shooter, who was just 17, was sentenced to 23 years in prison last July. A second man, Yasin Hayal, has now been convicted of masterminding the killing. He's been sentenced to life in prison. Back in 2010, though, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Turkey had failed to properly investigate the role of state officials in the murder. And the press freedom group Reporters Without Borders says no one can regard this case as solved. Elements within the police and judicial apparatus have been obstructing the investigation, and that the legal system did not give itself the resources it needed to get at the truth. Pakistan's lousy record of investigating murder cases involving journalists has just got worse. Investigators say they've drawn a blank in the killing of Salim Shahzad. Shahzad worked for Asia Times Online. His tortured body was found near Islamabad last May after he had told colleagues he had been threatened over his reporting on the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI, as well as the military there. The government set up a special commission to investigate the murder, which now says that those citizens were alarmed since the net of suspicion was cast on institutions of the state itself, that ultimately, from what is available on the record, unfortunately, the culprits cannot be identified. Press freedom groups are angry, but not at all surprised, because journalists can be murdered in Pakistan pretty much with impunity. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, since 1992, 23 reporters have been murdered in Pakistan. Only one of those cases has resulted in a conviction, and that was the killing of the American journalist, Daniel Pearl. Back in the days of the Soviet Union, the ruling communists had a newspaper they called Pravda, which is the Russian word for truth. The paper's propaganda was about as subtle as its title. Since then, times, political systems, and ideologies have changed. But in 2005, when the Kremlin was getting back into the news business, it created Russia Today, RT, as it's now known. RT is an international news channel set up to rival Western channels and to provide a Russian perspective. The network has since added 2 more channels broadcasting in Spanish and Arabic. RT's English language project is getting mixed reviews. Its criticism of Washington and the ways of the West is relentless, and it has a penchant for some offbeat stories and wacky conspiracy theories. The Listening Post's Anna D'Souza now on a channel that seems more interested in reviving the Cold War than reporting what's really happening in Russia today.
In Washington,
in Estonia, in Germany.
And she's the mother of a race of good aliens here on Earth called Pleiadians.
Was the sign of Satan worshippers, a satanic star.
They sell our dead bodies on a meat market of their own kind that goes passing by here every 50 years.
It's bright, brash, and often controversial, and features an unconventional cast of characters, including British Russophile Peter Lavelle, whose programme Crosstalk features atypical stories and some eccentric contributors.
They call themselves 9/11 truthers, skeptics, and truth activists.
And then there's Russian-born, American-educated Alyona Minkovsky, the 26-year-old host of The Alyona Show, who's more than happy to pick a fight.
Glenn Beck, that doughboy nut job from Fox News.
This is RT, Russia's English-speaking window on the rest of the world.
What do you think is really going on here?
Certainly in comparison with Russian television, it looks more professional. It's fast, energetic, responsive, more spectacular on the screen, more modern in terms of technological effectiveness and how journalists and presenters usually communicate.
We are suggesting our audience a number of stories that they probably will never see on any of the other television stations, what we call mainstream media.
In December, RT says it was the first Russian channel to start broadcasting on the biggest anti-government protests since the end of the Soviet Union, when it provided the most comprehensive coverage, though the bar on that was set pretty low.
We had a large team out on the street, 30 people, several correspondents, a lot of cameramen. We really tried our best to encapsulate what was going on.
So what? They couldn't not show it, because all the Western channels showed it as well. If BBC shows it, if Euronews shows it, if CNN shows it, where is Russia today? When there are so many people on the street, I believe it had to show them.
In fact, RT's coverage seemed to play down the significance of the protests.
Pro-United Russia rallies, one organised by Nashi.
Focusing heavily on the pro-government demonstrations that appeared in response. Compare that with RT's exhaustive reporting on last year's riots in London.
The events that are coming through seem to be getting from bad to worse.
And the Occupy movement that swept the US.
Now grown into a nationwide rally engulfing a growing number of US cities every day.
We have to give them credit for that. But they have a very outdated ideological perspective on things, on their reporting. Whenever somebody says, okay, people are protesting in Russia, something must be wrong, Russia Today immediately answers, no, look, it's even worse in America.
Police brutality, angry protesters. We've gotten used to seeing this during the Arab Spring, but now New York.
And I think one of Russia Today's big strengths is the West is in a mess, there's no doubt about it. They love any sign of protest and systemic weakness in the West is great for them.
The whole of central London around Westminster and the Houses of Parliament has been closed off to traffic.
The core of Russia Today is anti-Westernism. It's a paradox. They're broadcasting to the West, they're trying to portray Russia in good terms to the West, but it's actually the whiff or the stench of anti-Westernism pervades almost everything they do.
America sets itself up as a bastion of democracy and fairness, and yet during the Occupy Wall Street demonstration the police came down incredibly hard and very violently on what was essentially a peaceful demonstration, whereas Russia, doesn't set itself up to preach to the rest of the world about that.
But perhaps that's where RT comes in. Emerging in 2005, around the same time as Iran's Press TV, Qatar's Al Jazeera English, and France 24, all of which sought to provide English-language news content to the world, but from a very different perspective. Of course, there's another possible interpretation. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, journalism briefly flourished in Russia. But under Vladimir Putin, freedom of the press was stifled, as Kremlin-approved oligarchs bought up media outlets one after another. And none of those channels, including RT, is about to bite the hand that feeds them.
You don't see any real reporting about the war in southern Russia and the northern Caucasus, and you don't see anything about the Russian security services. You don't see any speculation about how much money Vladimir Putin has. You need to go somewhere else if you want to learn about what's really going on in Russia.
After a healthy workout, why not drop by for a haircut or a spa procedure?
You get these kind of silly stories about pets that can talk and just ludicrous sort of feel-good stories, while turning a complete blind eye to, I would say, the rather more serious problems such as lack of democracy, rule of law, collapsing infrastructure and the rest of it in Russia itself.
The politics behind RT are encapsulated by the actions of its editor-in-chief, Margarita Simonian, who was just 25 years old when she was appointed.
These most recent protests, I looked at her Twitter feed and she was tweeting about the pro-democracy protesters, "I hope they burn in hell," which is not what you expect from someone who runs a kind of supposedly impartial and fair news service. It's more the kind of thing you expect from an old-fashioned Soviet apparatchik. Margarita Simonian used to be in the Kremlin press pool, running around with President Putin, and it's clear that she has admirers in high places because you don't get given a TV station in your mid-20s unless someone likes you.
The senior ranks of Russia today repay detailed scrutiny. If you look at their background and their associations, it's clear these are people who are very well connected with the ruling regime. In theory, Russia Today would claim its independence, and I know some of the journalists there who genuinely think they're working for an independent television channel. It's just they so completely agree with the Kremlin's worldview that they think this is natural.
I don't think that the audience and people in general are so stupid that when they see propaganda they can't tell it from a relevant and an objective source of information.
But as Anna Kachayeva points out, RT's problem might well be a crisis of identity.
Russia Today does not really understand what they are, whether they're just an overseas broadcaster or whether they broadcast something globally Russian to the whole world.
We'll continue to do what we do. We think we do it well.
I think RT is emblematic of the failure of the Kremlin really to understand how the West works and how the Western media works. What they've done, it's the way the Kremlin solves most problems, is they just fling money at it. So RT is now everywhere. But it's not really doing them any good, I think, because it's very hard to take this channel seriously.
What's that? We are the mainstream media? No!
More Global Village Voices now on Russia Today.
We should look at RT in a greater context. Its primary objective is to enhance Russia's public diplomacy. To do that, RT has ventured to counter Western media hegemony and cover major news stories from a Russian perspective. So, if we look at the media environment as a field of contestation, RT certainly adds a voice. However, by itself, it cannot be seen as impartial or objective.
Russia Today, as I see it, focused primarily on news from the United States and the West, and it has a pretty clear agenda about how to cover this news. I like the fact that we have an alternative source of information and a different view on what's going on in the West and the United States, but I would also expect that a channel that called Russia Today would provide more information about Russia today.
Finally, one of the best things about the World Wide Web is how it provides a creative outlet to people like the guys at Corridor Digital. They're a California-based team who like to spend their time making mini-films that they then post online. One of their latest offerings was shot on the streets of Los Angeles. There's almost a cartoonish feel to this, even the classic cartoon technique of jumping in and out of painted doors. Bringing graffiti to life with more than 1.5 million hits online, Brush with Death is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.